Winter 1879, Dry Hollow, Wyoming. A battered young mother flees barefoot through a killer blizzard with her newborn daughter. A widowed sheriff who buried his heart 4 years ago opens a door, and everything changes forever. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. Let's get started. The wind came down off the Wind River Range like the wrath of God himself, driving needles of snow sideways across the high plains. Dry Hollow sat hunched against it, a scatter of false front stores, a livery, a saloon that never closed, and a whitewashed church whose steeple leaned a little more every year. Folks said the town had a way of swallowing hope and spitting out bones. That winter, it tried its damnedest with Delilah Carter. Delilah was 22 and looked 40. 4 times her belly had swelled. 3 times Jed Carter had beaten the girl child out of her before it could draw breath. The preacher called it God's will. The doctor called it unfortunate. Jed called it getting rid of useless mouths. The 4th time the child lived long enough to cry. A girl again, small, red, perfect. Jed came in from the saloon smelling of rotgut and rage. He took one look, grabbed Delilah by the hair, and laid into her with fists and boots until her scalp split and her ribs sang. When she curled around the infant like a mother wolf, he kicked harder. "Get that thing out of my house," he snarled. So she did. Barefoot, bleeding, clutching the babe wrapped in a flour sack towel, Delilah stumbled into the storm. Snow filled the cuts on her soles. The cold went straight through her threadbare dress and into her marrow. She beat on the church door with a fist already turning blue. "Pastor Reeves, for the love of mercy!" Inside, the pastor listened to the wind howl, listened to the feeble thumps, and turned the key. "Ain't my place to come between man and wife," he muttered to the empty pews. Delilah sank to her knees on the frozen steps. The baby's cry thinned to a whimper. Darkness crowded the edges of her sight. Bootsteps crunched behind her, slow, deliberate. A shadow fell across the snow. Sheriff Thomas Graves stood there, greatcoat white with frost, badge glinting under the church lamp. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to any living soul since the fire that took his wife Mary and their boy Eli 4 years back. Folks said he only wore the star now because it kept him from putting the barrel in his own mouth. He looked at the woman bleeding into the snow, at the tiny bundle against her breast, and something cracked open inside his chest like thin ice on a late thaw. Without a word, he shrugged out of his coat, draped it over Delilah's shaking shoulders, and lifted both mother and child as easy as if they weighed nothing. The baby's cheek brushed the stubble on his jaw and left a wet streak there. Tears or snowmelt, impossible to tell. He carried them 3 streets over to the house on the edge of town everyone called the Graves place, though no one had seen a light in its windows since '75. The front door still hung crooked on leather hinges. The smell of old char clung to the walls. Thomas kicked it shut behind him, laid Delilah on the settee, and went to work. He built up the fire with splits he'd never burned because they'd been Mary's chopping. He heated water, cleaned the worst of the blood from Delilah's face and feet, wrapped her broken ribs tight with strips torn from his own spare shirts. When she tried to thank him, he only shook his head once, sharp, like a man shaking off flies. All night he sat in the rocker by the door, Winchester across his knees, listening for bootsteps that might mean Jed Carter had sobered up enough to come claiming property. None came. Outside, the wind screamed like a woman giving birth. By morning, the baby was burning with fever. Delilah dragged herself from the bed Thomas had given her, Mary's bed with the wedding ring quilt still on it, and staggered into the kitchen clutching the child. "She's dying," Delilah whispered. "Please, Sheriff." Thomas took the infant without hesitation. Tiny fists waved, weak as moth wings. He cradled her against his chest the way he once cradled Eli, and felt his heart split clean in 2. He laid the baby on the table, fetched the old tin box from the top shelf. Mary's medicine box, paint cracked, her careful script still legible. M. Graves, Dry Hollow. Inside were willow bark, laudanum, a jar of goose grease and turpentine for croup. He worked by lamplight, boiling willow tea, rubbing the greasy salve on the baby's chest, wrapping her in a blanket warmed at the hearth. When he closed the lid, he took a stub of carpenter's pencil and wrote across the top in block letters that shook only a little, "Hope!" Then he carried the child back to her mother and sat in the rocker again, not sleeping, not moving, until the fever broke near dawn and the baby's cry turned strong and hungry. Days slid into weeks. The storm locked the town in white. Delilah's body mended slower than her spirit. She rose before Thomas each morning, swept 4 years of ash from the hearth, scrubbed soot from the walls, coaxed sourdough to life in a crock that hadn't been used since Mary. She sang to the baby in a cracked voice, old hymns, mountain ballads, anything to keep the silence from swallowing them. Thomas watched her move through his dead house like a candle, moving through a tomb. One afternoon, he came in with an armload of cedar planks and began tearing out the burned timbers at the back. Nails squealed. Dust danced in the cold light. By the time the thaw came, there was a new room with a real window and a cradle he'd built himself from cottonwood, sanded smooth as riverstone. Tongues wagged, of course. Decent women crossed the street when Delilah walked to the mercantile with Hope strapped to her chest in a shawl. The preacher quoted scripture about adulteresses, old men at the saloon laughed that the sheriff had finally found something warmer than his badge to keep him company. Thomas heard it all and said exactly 6 words the day Harlan Pike spat in Delilah's path. "Next man touches her answers to me." He said it quiet. Nobody tested him. Spring came late that year, but when it came fierce. Mud, crowsong, the smell of sage on the wind. Hope learned to crawl across the new pine floor Thomas had laid. Delilah's hair grew back thick and black again. She laughed sometimes, startled by the sound of it. Then one May evening the door crashed open and Jed Carter lurched in, whiskey-sick and wild-eyed, Colt in his fist. "That's my woman and my whelp," he roared. "Hand 'em over, Graves, or I'll gut you and burn this place again." Thomas had been expecting him for months. He rose from the table slow, set Hope in her cradle, and stepped between Jed and the women. "Put the gun down, Jed." Jed swung the Colt. Thomas moved faster than a man his size had any right to, caught the wrist, twisted. Bones snapped, the pistol thudded to the floorboards. Thomas spun Jed face first into the wall, kicked his legs apart, and snapped on the cuffs he'd carried every day since the blizzard. "Jedediah Carter," he said, voice flat as a judge's gavel, "you're under arrest for assault, attempted murder, and being too damn stupid to know when you've lost." Folks said later it was the first time in Wyoming history a wife testified against her husband in open court and lived to tell it. Delilah stood straight in a calico dress Thomas had bought her with his own money, Hope on her hip, and told the jury everything, every kick, every stillborn daughter buried in unmarked ground behind the cabin, every time Jed laughed while she bled. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. When she finished, you could hear snow melting off the courthouse roof. The jury, 12 ranchers who'd known Jed since he was a boy, took less than an hour, 10 years in the territorial prison at Laramie. Jed screamed as they dragged him out, promised to kill them all. Thomas just closed the gate behind him and didn't look back. Summer baked the plains. Sagebrush turned silver under the sun. One evening Thomas came home with a small cedar box in his hands. Inside lay Eli's old rattle, painted blue, and a silver christening cup he'd ordered from Denver. He set the box on the table and cleared his throat twice before he could speak. "I ain't good with words, Delilah, never was. Mary used to say I could no more talk my heart than a coyote could sing psalms." He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "But I'm asking anyway. You and Hope, you've made this house breathe again. If you'd let me, I'd like to give the little one my name, and if you'd have me, I'd like to give you mine." Delilah looked at him a long time. Hope was asleep against her shoulder, thumb in mouth, lashes dark against round cheeks. "Yes," she said simply. "They married the following Sunday under the big cottonwood by the creek. Just the preacher, who still looked ashamed, and old Doc Hollis and his wife for witnesses." Delilah wore a plain grey dress with lace at the collar she'd tatted herself. Thomas wore his Sunday coat, the one without the badge. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Thomas lifted Delilah clear off the ground and kissed her like a man who'd crossed a desert and finally found water. Hope, toddling now, grabbed Thomas around the knee and hollered, "Up, Pa!" clear as a bell. Thomas swung her high, eyes shining wet in the sunset, and the three of them stood there under the cottonwood, while meadowlarks called overhead and the creek ran gold with the last light of day. Later, Thomas hung a new shingle over the gate he'd built. The Graves family, Thomas, Delilah, and Hope. Years afterward, when travelers asked how a broken sheriff and a beaten woman ever found their way to happy, old-timers in Dry Hollow would point to that sign and say, "That winter of '79 was the coldest anybody could remember, cold enough to kill a body outright, but sometimes cold is just the Lord's way of cracking the ice so something new can grow." And if you rode past the Graves place on a summer evening, you might see a tall man with silver at his temples, tossing a dark-haired girl high in the air, while a woman with a scar on her cheekbone watched from the porch, smiling like sunrise. They say Delilah used to tell Hope, when tucking her in at night, "I was punished once for bearing daughters. Turns out the punishment was really a promise, because you, little one, were the road that brought me home." And that, stranger, is the gospel truth of Dry Hollow. Redemption don't always come riding a white horse with trumpets. Sometimes it comes barefoot through a blizzard, carrying a baby named Hope.